Brain injuries of any kind can cause emotional and psychological impacts for those affected. And today we are going to be talking with a veteran, Todd Strader, who sustained a brain injury from his time in the military, but not the way that most people would think. He is actually working to bring awareness that blast over pressure from firing weapons and artillery can cause brain trauma. There is always hope, and you are not alone. Hi, I'm Cristabelle Braden, and this is my brain injury podcast, Hope Survives. Here we share information, education, and support for the brain injury community. This is an uplifting podcast to bring hope to your darkest days. As a survivor of traumatic brain injury and multiple concussions, I know what it's like to struggle to find hope. I don't want anyone to feel as alone as I did, and that's why I started my online community called Hope After Head Injury. This podcast is an extension of that, and I'd love to invite you to join along as we explore the realities of life with brain injury, with messages of encouragement, interviews with doctors and professionals, and survivor stories. No matter where you're at on your journey, there is always hope. With a little hope, you can make it through today. With a little faith, someday you'll get through the pain. Just a little love is enough to light the way through your darkest night. Hope survives. A little faith, a little love. Hope survives. Hey friends, welcome back to Hope Survives podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Today we are going to be talking with, as I said in the intro, Todd Strader, who's a veteran from the military. And he is going to be sharing his personal experience with brain injury and his journey through symptoms and how it affects his life. And oh my gosh, I think you guys are going to be really encouraged by a lot of what he shares and maybe be able to relate to some of his symptoms. Especially, I don't interview a lot of men, I realized, probably because most of my friends happen to be female, or the people that I end up interacting with most and developing friendships with. And so I am really glad to have a male perspective on the podcast. We also had another one of my friends, Kevin McDonald, earlier in this season. And he's a survivor of brain injury. And for those of you who are men who listen to this podcast, I think it's important for you to hear men talking about the psychological impacts of brain injury, because I think it's important to see all sides of what we experience. And especially as a veteran, he's going to talk a lot about how you're trained to be tough in the military, right? Like you're trained to be tough and push through. And he started to realize with his brain injury symptoms that there was something off. He was not able to just kind of push through the way that he could before. And so a lot of what he does now with his community is he's trying to help these guys that are getting out of the military to even know that they have brain injuries. Could you imagine living with brain injury symptoms and not realizing that's where it comes from? And unfortunately, that's the case for so many veterans who are living with this particular type of brain injury. So Todd's going to explain it better than me, but I'm going to read this off his website. It is a brain injury based on occupational exposure to excessive amounts of low-level blast overpressure, firing heavy weapons like mortars and artillery. So basically, from firing a weapon, it causes like a wave, just like a heavy force that impacts the brain. And by doing this over and over again, many of these members of the military are being impacted by brain injury without ever knowing that they've sustained one. And so he's trying to work with the different organizations for veterans and trying to bring awareness to that this even exists, especially with the research and everything. And so he has an online support group, and what he's been able to do is help these people that come out of the military to even find out that they have a brain injury. And we talk a little bit in this conversation about how freeing that must be for them, Because if you're experiencing brain injury symptoms, could you imagine not knowing why you're feeling these ways? And it's invisible. It's also invisible to me. Like I can look in the mirror, I can't see my own brain injury, right? So being able to help bring awareness, and also to know that your symptoms are valid. And I think that's what a lot of this conversation is about, how yeah, brain injury causes emotional struggles and memory loss, and you feel out of it a lot. And that is valid. And you are not just crazy or just tired or just, you know, it's not just mental health. There's a deeper level when it's actually neurological. So, without further ado, I'd love to get into Todd's interview. Thank you so much for being here on the podcast. I think I say that a lot without further ado. There is a little bit of further ado. I just want to say for those listening, if this is your first time listening, welcome to the podcast. We also have Zoom support groups. I'd love to meet you on any of those groups. You can join at hopeafterheadinjury.com. You can find more resources and information on there. Our library of past episodes, you can search with keywords on what you're interested in, as well as getting connected in the Hope After Head Injury Zoom community support group and the brain injury Bible study group, if that's something you're interested in, that I run once a month. So thank you so much for being here. There's always hope. And now, without real ado, let's get into the interview. I'm here with Todd Strader, who is a veteran and survivor, and he has an incredible story and advocacy that he's been doing for veterans. And so we actually met in Washington, D.C. in this past March at the Brain Injury Awareness Day at the Capitol. So it's so good to see you again, Todd.
Likewise, Cristabelle, good to see you. I'm so how fortuitous it was that we met, and I appreciate you having me on to talk about what's going on with us.
Yes, of course. So when we were in DC, he shared some of the information about his advocacy efforts for veterans through, is it called Blast Overpressure? Um,
Right, it's called what we occupational exposure to low level blast overpressure from firing heavy weapons. Now they're called Tier 1 weapons, which are like mortars and artillery, and you'll see in the TV these guys firing these rockets on their shoulders. All those
mm,
put off a tremendous boom when they go off, and now they're finding research and science is telling us now that's causing brain damage in soldiers. It's not that it's a new
wow.
problem; the problem's been going on a long time. It's that the science to identify it is new. So that's
Hmm.
what we're trying to spread
That's such a
awareness
good
about.
point. Yeah. Well, can you share some of, your background and a little bit of who you are and what you do, and then we'll kind of get into more of your story.
Okay, no problem. I began my journey on this. I'm a veteran, Army veteran. When I was in service in the mid 90s, I fired mortars, these heavy mortars. Uh, and at the time, there was no thought of any kind of blast over pressure. We didn't know then what we didn't know, basically. So, thousands of exposures as a young man to these low level blasts. Uh, got out of service about almost a decade later, started really developing. I developed headaches in service. I had headaches while I was in the service, and I got treatment for those. And then after I got out, the headaches really started getting worse and worse. And then there were other, indirect symptoms that went along with that. So I decided that I should make a claim for VA disability benefits and compensation from the VA because I knew that my headaches started while they were in service. I knew they got treatment while I was in service, and I knew that they were ongoing and getting worse. So, and that's basically the criteria you had to meet for VA benefits is you have to have a proof of something happening when you were in service, that you got medical treatment for it, that you still have a diagnosis for it, and it's still a problem. So you meet all those criteria, you should technically be able to, it's never that easy, but it should be.
Yeah.
So
It should be. Yeah.
they sent me back a denial, which wasn't really what unexpected. What was unexpected was that the reason they gave me for the denial was that they couldn't locate my medical treatment records for when I was in the Army. Not that they denied I had headaches or anything. They just said, no, you're denied because we can't find the records that we're responsible for maintaining. So we're going to deny you your benefits because of that. So that pretty much incensed me at the time. So it put me on a kind of a mission, if you will, because I felt that was a terrible wrong to uh, to and looking into it, it seems it's not that it doesn't happen often, but it's not uncommon that that happens. That a soldier's records are just disappeared and they're denied their benefits because of the government's own fault of not being able to keep the records. So that really upset me. So at the time, I was working at a law firm, and I had an understanding about how to compile evidence to build a case to win your argument, basically. So I set out to do that. I didn't understand what caused my headaches while I was in the service. I just knew that they started when I was in the service and that I got treatment for them. So based on that, I had to start looking into what happened in the service that caused these headaches, and call it coincidental, I call it providential, that around that same time, 2018, 2019, there was this study that was just came out called "Protecting Warfighters from Blast Injury," and it was basically a culmination of studies done by DoD and then NIH, identifying that these weapons produce a blast wave that injures the brains of the soldiers that fire them. And there was some publicity on it at the time. So I can't remember how I came across that, but I did. And once I learned that the connection was obvious, of course, why didn't I think of that before? I remember being around these blasts, and they feel like you're getting punched in the face, but you never connected the dots that, oh, it's like a boxer getting 1,000 small hits to the head over a lifetime add up to big problems, as much as one massive hit to the head can cause. So even
Yeah,
though
like
this type of brain
CTE
injury
in
doesn't have
football
any kind,
players,
I'm
right?
sorry, what's
Like
that?
CTE in football players.
It's
That's been
similar.
getting a lot
It's more
more
CT.
attention.
People, it's good to kind of make that association to the NFL and the CTE, but they're not quite the same. They're a little bit different
Okay.
kind of a brain injury. Uh,
Okay.
Consider it maybe kissing cousins, sort of. So these blast waves, nothing in human evolution prepared the human brain to be exposed to these blast waves. And it really wasn't until the onset of heavy weapons in World War One that soldiers started being exposed to these. And it was around that time that they started coming up. At the time, they called it shell shock. Soldiers just being pounded from the repetitive concussive blasts of these things, and nowadays we call it PTSD, but call it whatever you want. It resembles the same set of symptoms that are in soldiers, and so it's a big issue. I'm not sure where that tangent went. So
No, I appreciate you sharing that. And it's something that you had no idea of the risk of this when you got
no,
into
not at
it,
all. And
or
like I said, you can't really fault the Army or anything like that. They didn't know what they didn't know at the time. Back then, our only concern was protecting your hearing, which was you did the best you could in a practice, in a real world scenario. But yeah, blast exposure, even though we knew, you get, it feels like you're getting hit in the head. Uh, you never connected the dots. So the science came out, and it became clear to me that this is the connection I was looking for. And so I started building my case to prove my claim with the VA. And as I'd research the articles, I'd find one article from DOD or wherever, and in their citations, they have to cite where they got their sources, and I'd go research, all the research that they base their research on. And as I would learn it and connect it to what was happening to soldiers, I would kind of share it. I'd make videos on YouTube where I'm kind of making excerpts from the science research articles and putting it into videos of the explosion happening. And then eventually I created a Facebook group where, now it's like a community of guys and affected people or people who are interested in what's going on to talk about what's happening. And now, the up until now, the problem has, I'm sorry, up until recently, the problem has been that the Department of Defense or the Department of Veteran Affairs, this type of brain injury hasn't been recognized because their standards for qualifying a traumatic brain injury was that the soldier had to lose consciousness or have an alteration of consciousness for, I think, 3 minutes or 30 minutes anyway. And you can define that how you want, but excuse me, also from a specific event. So you had to be knocked out or had your bell rung from one specific event. So there was no
Wow.
consideration of brain injury caused by these repetitive exposures to these occupational blasts. And so, like we said earlier, one thing that you think people need, especially providers, need to be aware of is that the VA and DoD was doing the same thing of only treating the individual symptoms. Okay, you have headaches, so we're going to treat you for headaches. You have PTSD symptoms, or actually, that let me strike that. So that brings up a good point with the PTSD. So this type of TBI can present PTSD symptoms. Okay, so a soldier or veteran can go seek treatment because I'm presenting these PTSD like symptoms. And then they go to the medical provider at the DoD or the Veterans Affairs. And the first thing they ask them is, well, were you in a traumatic event? Well, maybe they weren't, but they still have these symptoms because that's a result of this kind of brain damage. So then they're denied any kind of PTSD or behavioral treatment for that. And that the same thing went for TBI. If you didn't meet the threshold, if you went to your doctor presenting, chronic post concussive symptoms that are getting worse, and you go to the medical provider and they ask, okay, well, did you lose consciousness from a single event or blunt force or something like that? And if they say no, well, guess what? You're not getting TBI treatment. You're just going to get treatment for headaches, and so
Yeah, wow.
there's been a,
That's such a
a
good
huge
point
gap in
because
understanding that
oh no, I
that
just
there's a
wanted to
root.
say
Go ahead. Sorry.
sorry, it's the delay on the recording.
Right.
Um yeah, I agree there's a gap in understanding. I think that's such a good point because so many times even in in the non-veteran world, brain injuries get misdiagnosed by mental health. So
Right.
somebody could be fatigued and they get misdiagnosed as depression, or somebody could have dysautonomia and be in a state of fight or flight and they get misdiagnosed as anxiety. Or people
Right.
with brain injuries could be having all of these symptoms from a concussion
Right.
that went undiagnosed, and they're
Right.
trying to go to a psychologist or they're being treated with mental health and antidepressants, but antidepressants are not going to help somebody when it's neurological. And
If it's an
so
injury, right.
exactly, if it's an injury. And so what I
Right.
really appreciate what you're saying because you're showing that the low level blast overpressure exposure is causing a brain injury, especially repeated over time,
Right.
and it's not being recognized as an injury.
Right.
So if I understand correctly, they're being treated as if they have PTSD or other mental health things or just headaches, and there's no understanding that this actually causes an injury.
Or not treated at all. or
or
denied
not
treatment
treated at all.
multiple or treatment and
Yeah.
benefits altogether. You know what I mean? So I'm
Mm,
saying
that's
we
hard.
can't establish a connection that this happened in service because they don't recognize the repetitive exposure, the deleterious effects of these exposures on the brain. And these so in the world of TBI, the brain is a universe unto itself, right? So there's so many different ways it can be damaged. You got the blunt force, hypoxia, all different kinds of TBI. Ours is a little bit unique from the others in that when this blast wave happens, you have a super expansion and contraction of air from these super hot gases that come out of the weapon. Okay. And they expand and contract the air super fast. And you'll see this blast wave in the videos, you'll see it go out, right? So that same thing goes through the soldier's brain, but when it's going through the skull, it bounces around. And you guys might know that if in the TBI world, the consistency of the brain is like a tofu, okay? Consistency. And in these blast waves, the brain, each one does the tiny little compression and then release. So the blast goes off and then there's a tiny little compression, right? Just like that. So in all these folds that the brain has, and these thousands of little hits like this, like an NFL player or a boxer to the head, these blasts, what they call it micro shearing, and it starts shearing the regions of the brain that talk to each other, and eventually this shearing causes scarring. The scarring leads to interruptions and dysfunctions and other problems downstream in what's happening, and that's been really foundational of what's motivated me to spread awareness on this. Is that in our community, the military veteran community with the TBIs, it's a little bit taboo of a thing to talk about until kind of recently. More and more awareness is being done about it. But without more understanding of the 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 vast effects the brain has on a person, especially when it's damaged in presenting so many various symptoms, like we said, every person is different. So in our world, and the veterans and the service members, I believe there's a strong connection to the suicide problem that we're having with 22 a day killing themselves. And that's when I got into this, I asked a researcher into the suicide issue, and I asked him, is that hyperbole? Is that like, maybe one day it reached 22 a day, and then maybe 10 is the average, really? And they said no, it's really 20 to 22 a day kill themselves. And we're learning now that there's a strong correlation with these suicides to their military background if they were exposed to repetitive low level blasts, because it affects the brain in a way, like I said, that interrupts all these systems. There's no part of the brain that's not affected by these blast waves. So it plays, everybody who's a TBI survivor knows that your brain injury plays out in so many different ways. But the key to getting my community to understand is that the way that these things can play out can be PTSD, anxiety, depression. So without getting the proper treatment for it, soldiers and veterans are often made to feel like they're the problem. That like the medical providers don't understand that there's a root brain and there's a root TBI cause to going that maybe the injury that's been caused to the brain could be, what's happening here. So trying to spread awareness that how soldiers feel, and the emotions that they can have that drive them to these really dark places, getting them to understand that all of those need to be looked at as more of a reaction to an injury, like a limp to a bad knee, as more as like as opposed to something is wrong with them, which is I
Yeah,
think the
that's such a
stigma.
good point.
I think the stigma is now that well, we don't you don't have any history of TBI. You weren't exposed to a single event where you lost consciousness. You weren't in a excuse me, you weren't in a traumatic event. So we don't. I guess you're the problem, really. So you just don't know how to cope, and good luck. And the young soldier or veteran takes that home, not understanding that all the emotions and
Mm.
things that are happening to them that they don't understand have a root source, and that it's the response of an injury more so than it is than a character defect. And I think when they don't understand that, and their family doesn't understand that, and the medical providers understand that, I think somehow these connections that are interrupted in the brain from the deepest parts of the brain, like the cerebellum, and where your primal brain, these ideas, these ideations come from, of wanting to not be here anymore, or you feel like you're a burden to anybody, and you just don't want to be here anymore. And the it just feels like the best thing you want to do in the world is just end it right now. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
I
that's so
we
hard. And
really
brain
want to
injury
work to.
causes issues with identity to begin with. Like for
Absolutely.
those,
Absolutely.
we for anybody who's had a brain injury, even if you know you have a brain injury, the symptoms can be so overwhelming. You start to feel like they are your identity. And we talk a lot about identity on the podcast, and on, realizing that I am not my symptoms and I'm more than my brain injury. But for someone like this who doesn't even have the capacity or knowledge to know that it is coming from a TBI,
Right.
that would be even more overwhelming, because not only are you experiencing all the TBI symptoms, but you're also not able to recognize it as such. And
Right.
I can see that the spiral snowball effect of that.
Yeah. And then you know, to add to it, soldiers or veterans who were in combat scenarios, new science shows that most of these people are young, and it's still a developing brain when they're exposed to these blasts. And if they were in a combat scenario, uh, and they did have multiple contributing factors, like it's not uncommon for myself, example, a soldier to have. I do have a TBI by their standards. I did have an event where I had altered consciousness, and got from a single event. I also hit my head once in airborne school really hard, because that's just part of it. That's why soldiers wear helmets. We hit our heads a lot, but you never give it a thought while you're in service. So you have these contributing factors, and then when you see that the brain is damaged by all of those together. So when you have a soldier, for example, who say hit his head in airborne school, or his Humvee rolled over and he hit his head in a Humvee crash or something like that, and then he was hit by an IED big blast, and then also for his job in the army, he fires artillery and is exposed to the repetitive blast. And this is, like I said, this is all usually in the brain that's a 25-year-old or younger brain that still hasn't fully developed. So it really has a huge consequence on these young guys, and like, just getting them to understand that this could be a root cause. I'm not saying it's the answer to everything. Not all smokers get lung cancer, but it's this still, it causes problems. You know what I mean? So getting them to understand that there's a root cause to what could be happening with them, hoping that buys them a half second to step back from the edge when they feel like they want to get out of here, and just take
Mm.
that half second to think, hey, wait a minute, maybe things aren't really what I perceive them to be. Maybe my brain is just getting flushed with emotions. Like, I do the same thing as you said. I deal with this stuff myself. We talk about surviving, but every day is surviving. When the things get going in your head, and it's hard to remember that, hey, it's your injury. But if you can, and buy yourself that half second you need to just step back from the edge, and not you know go to that dark place and think, wait a minute, I'm responding to an injury. And then I think there's another part of it that's just as important, and that's the family. the family has to understand what's going on. So in the military or veteran community, when it comes to these TBIs like this, uh, if the medical providers aren't aware of it, the soldier's not aware of it, the family certainly isn't aware of it. So they see these things happening in their soldier and they don't understand that there's a this is a response to an injury. You know what I mean? So they don't get the family support they need, which makes them feel more of an outcast. I'm sure that's common in the TBI community in general. You know what I mean? But so yeah, the more awareness family has as well is just as crucial. I think.
Hmm.
I know
Yeah,
I
it
went off
really
on a
is
wild
because
tangent right there.
relationships are relationships are our life, you know? It's your family, your friends, and brain injury impacts the way that you interact with them, and it impacts your emotional responses, and it impacts your ability to have self control or your ability to be able to communicate and to find the right words. Or,
Right,
you know, when you're fatigued all the time, you can't really help around the house. So then it's like, why are you being lazy? It's like, you're not
right,
being
right,
lazy. You just have a
right.
brain injury and
I don't
your
know what's
brain
the
is
matter with
too
you. You're not the
overwhelmed.
same person anymore. You're always angry. You know what I mean? That kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's so hard, especially when it's not understood or not diagnosed. So, can you share do you mind sharing some of the symptoms that you have experienced um
Sure.
from
I
this?
think Walter Reed did some research around the 2020s, and they started pointing to what's called excuse me, chronic post concussion syndrome type array of
Yeah.
symptoms. So basically, like a mild concussion, that symptoms that just don't go away. They can be, and they can, every TBI person knows that they affect everyone differently. So it can be like mine. Biggest thing I think is my migraines. I get migraines. Some people's others, their loss of memory, or maybe anxiety presents more. Or sometimes all of them are, you know, like you said, when the juices get flowing in there, sometimes all of them are raging. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Everything's out of control, and on the control panel up there, sometimes it feels like. So
Yeah.
yeah, so headache, dizziness, loss of memory, cognition problems, uh, and that's especially important on the battlefield, because if you have a soldier, let's say we have Private Joe Snuffy, and he's in Iraq. He's an airborne, he's an airborne paratrooper, so he's probably hit his head a couple times jumping out of airplanes. He fires heavy weapons, so he's exposed to these blasts. You know what I mean? And he'll start in the battlefield, or even in training. We know that these repetitive hits can start having an effect on a soldier's memory or their cognition, and that can be deadly on the battlefield. When, say, if you're calling in an airstrike on grid X, Y, and Z, and you say grid XZZ because your head's
Yeah.
not focused, that could be a big problem. You know what I mean?
The aphasia
So
and the word finding and communication.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's how it can have a big impact on the military as well,
Mm.
especially as it relates to readiness.
Yeah, and
So
one of the main symptoms with concussions and brain injuries is just being overwhelmed, just getting
right,
overstimulated by lights and noise and activity and crowds. And so I couldn't even
exactly.
imagine
I,
having
I
to
I
go through
I try to
that.
tell my community to be aware that your brain is damaged, and the brain affects everything, everything from how your toenails grow to your hair color to how you feel today to how you perceive the world around you. And you're right. I lost what we were talking about.
Yeah, we were talking about symptoms.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
loss of memory.
also
Thank you.
yeah, loss of memory. But
Yeah,
also, even when we were scheduling this podcast, we were messaging about what time, and you said, "Hey, can we do it in the morning? Because that's when my brain is more
right.
aware." And
Right.
because you have the capacity now, you know that you've had brain injury, and so you are able to organize your life in such a way of, hey, I'm actually a little more with it in the morning, so let's talk then because my brain gets tired by the afternoon. And I feel the same. I prefer the morning as well, so this is great. But
Good.
for somebody who might not be aware of that for themselves, that's where the danger is, because it's you end up overtiring yourself and then
Yeah.
feeling like,
Why am
why
I
is
so
this
tired?
going
Why I
on?
don't understand why I'm falling apart in
Yeah.
the afternoon. Yeah.
And
Well, that actually
also
started
the
happening to me. At my job, I worked at a law firm, and I was misnaming evidence. Putting it in
wow.
the wrong folders. That can add up to big problems. You know what I mean? So when you realize, like, I don't understand what's happening here, but because it was later part of the day, I've been doing a lot of multi things all day. My brain's spent, that kind of thing. I remember what I wanted to talk about when we talked about how you perceive things, and I think it's the impact on behavioral health that I think a lot of people it doesn't get enough attention, or need to understand too. Is that let me see, how was I going to put all this? So these in our community, these injuries can present these PTSD like symptoms, which is what you talk about: depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, paranoia, all these things. And these can all happen in a soldier or veteran without them understanding that, again, this could be more the response of an injury to your brain than what you think is really happening in the world around you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And especially emotions, because so many people, and especially men, and especially veteran men, because I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be in the army. And thank you for your service and going through that. But I would imagine that having heightened emotional responses would not be looked at favorably by a man. That, I mean, men in general, I think, struggle with that, but especially a soldier.
It is, and I would say that the heightened emotional response, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's a weird thing, and I think it's something that men don't really want to talk about in public. Crying for some silly reason, that whatever, when, like, you get them, what is happening. I mean, I've even been with family members, and they're like, "It's okay," and it's okay, and I'm like, "No, you don't understand. I can't turn this off. I'm trying to turn it off." You know what I mean? My it's so yeah, it's hard to even talk about, much less get somebody to even understand that, that over emotional response, either you to crying. Everybody's different. You know what I mean?
It can also present as anger
Yeah.
and not being able to control impulsivity, and
Yeah.
and I think, I mean, as women, we're used to hormones and things affecting our moods. So it's like,
Right.
I think, I don't know, but I would imagine that the way that a woman would struggle with emotions after brain injury, it's a lot, but we're also used to that even a little bit more. I would feel like for a man that would be very disconcerting and overwhelming.
Well, it could, yeah, I'm sure it is, definitely. But I'm glad you brought up women, because in today's modern military, women are given, more and more roles in positions that were traditionally for men only, and some of those are going to be exposed to these low level
The
chronic
blasts,
blasts.
yeah.
And I'm sure it's going to present an issue on women's health in the future as well. If
Yeah.
there's not big precautions taken. But in DoD's defense, I can say that last August they issued a new policy where they want a whole lot of new measures and policies put in place, where they've identified that these chronic blasts can cause brain issues. They want to start tracking them,
Oh, that's
better
great.
better ways to treat them, and things like that. And it seems
So
like the
have you
Department of
had
Veteran Affairs. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask, with the Department of Veteran Affairs, and they have a branch that does brain injury research. So are they the ones that are starting to look into this now?
Yeah, they're all looking into it. Actually,
That's great.
I attended this year's military health research symposium in Orlando, where all the military health from around the world go and talk. And I was really pleased to see how big of a portion of their time was given to discussing TBI caused by this repetitive low level blast, and the
That's
amount of
great.
study that's going into it now, and the resources, and it's good. And I think the day is coming soon that, you know, earlier you mentioned the NFL, and I love to use, even though it's not quite the same thing, but like I said, kissing cousins, the same evolution needs to happen in the Army and the Department of Defense and the Veteran Affairs, and that, as did with the NFL. First, the NFL tried to say, nope, nope, there's nothing happening here. They didn't want to recognize that there's a possible health consequence to these careers of being hit to the head. And then their players started having problems, killing themselves, beating up their girlfriends or whatever. And I think there was Aaron Hernandez, I think is his name, the football player. Uh, they cut his brain open and they found the CTE, which is what started so that it was at that point that the NFL had to recognize through, despite all the awareness, the awareness campaign finally reached a point where the NFL had to accept that, okay, we have a problem. It is an issue. And then once you make that past that event horizon from awareness to acceptance, that, just like in the NFL, turned into action. So now in the NFL, you have better equipment. You have helmets that are better designed to consider brain injury. You have much stiffer penalties for players who hit the brain. If a soldier presents a head injury on the field, he goes through this huge protocol on the sideline now. So that awareness, acceptance, and action is the same thing that needs to happen in the Department of Defense and Veteran Affairs. And happily, I can say that I think we're right at the cusp of going over from the awareness to the acceptance, especially on the DoD side. The DoD is finally now saying, okay, I think we have a problem here. The
Yeah, that's
uh,
good
the
news.
VA hopefully will tip that way soon, but
Yeah.
right now they
Well,
still think the Earth is flat.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing this awareness and some of your personal story and experiences. I think this brings a lot of value to our listeners to hear because there's so many different types of brain injuries or different ways to get brain injuries. And this is one that I think people need to be aware of and need to know that this is possible. And so thank you for sharing. Are there any last words of hope you would like to share with our listeners or anything that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get to?
Yeah, I think a lot of times brain injuries can be overlooked because they don't have any kind of overt symptoms, and the symptoms can be subtle sometimes outwardly until they get rolling and out of control. Like we've talked about, and I really just want to bring up the point again and kind of give hope to to soldiers or veterans who might be struggling in a dark place to maybe take a second, and if they were in a military background that was exposed them to repetitive blasts, maybe they should take a second and consider that there might be something going on with their brain and they're not the problem, and it might be more of a response to an injury than a character flaw. And I think making that pivot from awareness to acceptance, once you make that, it's all downhill from there, and everything just kind of sorts itself out. But getting it over from the awareness to the acceptance event horizon there, I think is huge. So if we can just change that way of thinking just a little bit in everybody, I think that'd be great. Even in the broader TBI community, I think that's something that everybody needs to realize. And I've made a little bit of connection, I think, when I use that metaphor that, it's, think of it like a limp to a bad knee. It's a symptom of an injury, and your mind is doing the same thing. It's just weird a weird way of presenting it. That's all.
Yeah, a
And
weird limp.
I think
Yeah.
really just understanding how complex your brain is, how your injury, how your brain has been affected by your injury, and the multitude of ways that plays out in your daily life. I think just can if you're aware of it and have a basic understanding of it, just buys you a little bit more of, I don't know, peace of mind. Maybe, I don't know. I can't speak for everyone, but I see a trend. I know we're running over time, but I want to talk about something real quick if we can. So, in this campaign of bringing this awareness to soldiers and veterans, the same it's very emotional to see the transition in them when you lay out the science and explain to them, and they realize, holy cow, this of course makes sense. I understand. All the dots are connected now. I'm not the problem. I have an injury. And you see this, it's almost like a weight get lifted off. You know what I mean? And
Oh yeah.
call it
Yeah.
you call it from shame to acceptance, or whatever you call it. But I get emotional talking about it too. But it's a neat thing to witness. So I think when people can do that, and you can make people aware of that, and just kind of point that out to them, and they can make that transition from shame that something's wrong with them, I'm the problem, to acceptance that, you know I have an injury, and this is all an indirect response to that injury.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. And that's the identity piece. That's where it's so important to realize that you are not your injury. And
Right.
this goes for
You are not the
anyone.
sum of your
Anyone
injuries.
listening. Yeah, anyone listening who's had any type of brain injury, you are not your injury. If you're a loved one and you're listening to this, realize that your survivor might not want to react these ways, but it's so hard when your brain is not functioning the way it should. And so thank you, Todd, for bringing awareness to this and for bringing that hope to so many that need to know this. And like you said, being able to help them. I mean, we didn't even get into it, but I'm sure you've had so many people that you've helped by explaining this to them.
Well, I'm pretty proud of our Facebook community now. We have almost 3,000 people, and a lot of those are
Wow,
service members, veterans. We have researchers. Uh, there's a writer for the New York Times named Dave Phillips, who's been doing an expose on these kind of things in the military. He's one of our group people, follows us there. So
that's
it's
great.
it's a really neat place, and it's allowed people to come in and, you know, get a better understanding of what's happened to them, and also share with the community what, maybe their story, or ask questions. Hey, this is happening to me. Could this be a problem with this? Who can I go talk to? That kind of thing. So I'm pretty proud of that. And yeah, I do get some anecdotal messages sometimes, of people thanking me, or telling me how the information has helped them in one way or another, and that's plutonium to my core. That keeps me going.
Mm, thank you. So your website is overpressured.com.
Right,
And so if
right.
anyone wants to get in touch with you, I will put that link in the show notes.
Great. Thank you very
So
much. And from
great.
there, you can find out a lot more. There's a lot of articles in the press, like I said, the New York Times, and some other things you can learn about us.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Todd.
Well, I appreciate you having me on and letting me run my mouth for a while. I know I went in a lot of different directions. It's probably gonna be like
No, it was
herding
great.
cats trying to edit all that.
No, no, no. It'll be great. That's what always happens. Sometimes the tangents are the best parts of the podcast because it's like the natural conversation. So I'm grateful. Thank you for sharing.
No problem. No problem. My pleasure. Thanks again for having us on and giving us your platform.
Thanks so much for tuning in to Hope Survives podcast. Make sure to subscribe and stay tuned, and would love for you to consider leaving us a rating or a review. Check out hopeafterheadinjury.com for more. I'll see you next time, and remember, there's always hope.